Good morning, good afternoon, and good night. I'm KT, and this is What Happened. Tonight, we're going to talk about an amazing woman. She was an educator, a sex therapist, a scout, and a sniper. That's right, I'm talking about Dr. Ruth Westheimer. She had an amazing story, and she overcame what seemed to be monumental setbacks in life. So I can't wait to get into it. So sit back and relax, and let's start with part one, a traumatic childhood. Dr. Ruth, as she would later come to be known, was actually born as Corolla Ruth Siegel, and she was born in 1928 in the village of Weissenfeld, which is now Karstadt am Main in Germany. She was the only child to Orthodox Jews. Her mother, Irma, was a housekeeper, while her father, Julius, was a notions wholesaler. That is a person who sells sewing materials such as needles and thread, things that you would use to craft. Growing up, she lived in an apartment in Frankfurt with her parents and her grandmother, Selma, who was her father's mother. She had been a widow by that time. At this point, I'm going to gloss over her very early childhood, and we're going to start when she is around 10 years old. Her father, Julius, was 38 years old when he was taken away by Nazis, and they took him to the Dachau concentration camp. If you're new here, I will definitely put the words on the screen because I know I don't pronounce it right a lot of the times. This was a week after a major event that translated to be called the Night of the Broken Glass. This is when Nazis came and they burnt down 10,000 Jewish stores. They also burnt down homes and synagogues. That was in November 1938. So a week later, they're here and they come and they snatch her father. At the time, her name was Corolla. Corolla cried, and her grandmother handed the Nazis money, begging for them to please take good care of him. It was a futile effort. At this time, things were escalating very rapidly, or maybe I should say deteriorating. For the Jewish community, it was a scary time, so people had actually worked to set things up. One of those things was called the Kinder Transport. These were people who were working really hard to try to get children to safety. At this time, Corolla's grandmother and mother knew that it wasn't safe. They decided, and this was a very hard decision, I can only imagine, that they would put Ruth, who was the only child, on this Kinder train, and the Kinder Transport would take her safely to Switzerland, prayerfully, right? Of course, Ruth didn't want to leave. What 10-year-old would want to leave everything they know? Even if it is a scary time, you want to be by who you are used to being with. But this was a decision. It was made. And one of the saddest things is later, Dr. Ruth said that after she was 10 years old, as a child, when she got on that train, she was never hugged again as a child. The good news is she did arrive safely in a Jewish orphanage with 300 children. Some of them were as young as 6 years old. By the end of World War II, nearly all of them were orphans because their parents had been killed by the Nazis. In the orphanage, little Ruth took on cleaning duties. She also took on more of a motherly role to the younger children, even though she was still young. Unfortunately, girls in the orphanage were not allowed to get an education. The good thing for Ruth is that there was a little boy that she befriended there, and he would sneak her books and she would read them at night. And he did this continuously so that she was able to keep up with some learning where other girls did not have that opportunity in the orphanage. During Corolla's time at the orphanage, she did correspond with her mother and grandmother by letter. Unfortunately, in 1941, the letters stopped. And this is how she knew her mother and grandmother had probably been lost. Of course, she could find out later what happened because the government worked really hard to put together archives so that people could try to track down relatives that had been taken away. And we'll get into more of that later. And certainly in the comments, if you are from Germany or have a lot more knowledge than I ever would of the history of that time, please drop it in the comments what you know about it. I love to learn. I love to read about new things, even new old things. Now, when Corolla was young, she thought her father had died in the first concentration camp that he was taken to. She actually learned that her father and his mother, her grandmother Selma, died in 1942. They ended up being deported to Lodz Ghetto. Her mother would have been lost at some point in that time, but she never found official records that explained her death. So there was a whole category of people known as missing or deceased. That's where her mother fell into that category. But the really horrible thing is that she would later find out that all of her family died. Any extended family, she had everybody. She was a woman alone in the world, truly, at this time. Later, Dr. Ruth would talk about what she called an irrational guilt because she felt like if she hadn't have left on the Kinder Transport, which she didn't have a choice, but she felt like if she hadn't have left, that she would have been able to save her family. But in later life, she had a different perspective, and she looked at her parents, her mother, her grandmother, especially as being extremely brave because after she had children, she didn't think she would have been strong enough to send her children away from her in order to save them. And so she started to look at it instead of from a place of guilt, from a place of pride for her family and the things that they did to save her. Next, we're going to go on to part 2. I'm going to call part 2 New First. At the age of 16, Corolla decided that she would immigrate to British-controlled Mandatory Palestine. And that's exactly what she did in 1945. She worked in agriculture. She was told that her name sounded too Jewish and that she should change it. She started to go by Ruth K. Siegel, and the K was her actual first name, Corolla. She decided to keep that name in case any of her family ever came looking for her, because at the time she did not know that she didn't have any family left. I can't imagine immigrating to a new country at the age of 16, but that wasn't all. Going by Ruth now, Ruth had other firsts. She had her first sexual encounter on a starry night. It was in a haystack without contraception, and she talked about this later in life. She told the New York Times that she was not happy about that, but what she was saying is, hey, I didn't know better when I did that, but it's that saying, once you know better, you do better. And she did, and she went on to educate more people. But put a pin in that, because we're going to get into that later as well. In 1948, Ruth moved to Jerusalem to study early childhood education. This is where it gets really interesting. Once settled, she joined the Haganah Jewish Zionists. This was an underground paramilitary organization, which would later become the Israel Defense Forces. She was very short. Ruth was only 4 feet 7 inches tall. Because of this, they thought that she should be trained as a scout and a sniper, and so she was. She did say that she never had to use those sniper skills in that way, but she was sharp. She could assemble a rifle in the dark. She actually went on later to demonstrate this. While she was 90 years old, she did it on a TV show. She actually closed her eyes and reassembled a weapon. But back to the story. In case you didn't think this was enough trauma and enough things to overcome, Ruth turned 20 years old, and she was seriously wounded in action by an exploding shell. It was during a fire attack on Jerusalem during the Palestine War. The explosion actually took out 2 girls that were standing right beside her, and Ruth almost lost both of her feet. In fact, the top portion of one of her feet was completely gone. Because of this, she spent a long time paralyzed. She went to a recuperative ward and was there for months and months before she could even walk again, and when she got out, she walked home. Later on, when she was more settled in life and older, she would go on to visit Israel every year. She identified as a Zionist. If you don't know what that is, to make it very short and summarized, it was a movement aimed at establishing a Jewish presence in Palestine. But this was another difficult time in her life. So let's go on to 1950. Now Ruth is 22 years old. Can you believe where we are in this story? We've been talking about all these traumatic events, and Ruth is only 22. Let's think about that. At 22, Ruth actually got married, and she moved to France with her first husband, David Barham. He was an Israeli soldier, and they went to France because he was actually accepted into a medical school in Paris. It was in Paris where she studied psychology under a psychologist who you may have heard of, Jean Piaget. She studied under Jean Piaget at the University of Paris, the Sorbonne. This is when Ruth earned her undergraduate degree without having ever completed any lower level studies, secondary school, high school. She never did that, but she got her undergraduate degree. And I think that's amazing. She supported herself during this time by teaching kindergarten, so her early childhood studies actually came into play here. Once she got her degree, she actually taught psychology at the same university that she got her degree from. Unfortunately, her first marriage was coming to an end by this time because her husband decided to give up his studies in medical school and to move back to Israel. Ruth decided she was going to stay in Paris because she was really finding her way there. Their divorce was finalized at that point. Now I want to go back and talk about a couple other things that they did in Germany because of everything that happened to the Jewish people. They eventually worked to set up databases so you could try to find out the best that you could what happened to your family members, and some of them you would never know. You just assumed they weren't there anymore if they were alive. This wasn't an easy time of contact. There was no World Wide Web. Another thing that they did was set up some restitution funds. This is important because Ruth actually got 5,000 German marks. This was money earmarked as restitution for German children whose education was disrupted by the Holocaust. So in today's money, I believe, based on my research, that that's about 3,000 US dollars. So with this, she actually immigrated to the United States. By this time, she had a French boyfriend named Dan Baumer, and they went and lived in Washington Heights, Manhattan. They ended up marrying, and this is where Ruth had her first child, Miriam. However, they did later get divorced. During this time, Ruth worked as a maid, making 75 cents an hour. Later, she would go on to make $1 an hour. So that is is equivalent to about $11.50 or 60 cents in today's time. The most important thing about this is that she was working as a maid to put herself through school. She was earning her master's degree in sociology from the New York School. Another program that helped Ruth do this, in addition to the restitution, she was able to use an organization named Jewish Family Services, and what they did was paid for her daughter, who was 3 years old at the time, to stay with a foster family during the day and go to a German school. And this is why Ruth was able to work and go to school during the day. So this was a good program where you would be able to see your child, but somebody that you could trust could take care of them, hopefully that you could trust, and then they could get some education in their home culture as well as U.S. culture, but also it gave you the freedom to be able to better yourself. This is why childcare is so important. I'm going to jump ahead a little more because Dr. Ruth's life is expansive and we've got to push it forward. Later on in life, she was 42 years old and she actually got her ED, which is a doctorate of education in family life studies from the Teachers College and Columbia University. How did she do this? She actually had the help of a scholarship to get this doctorate degree. And this is where things take off. She actually trained as a sex therapist at the New York Hospital, Cornell Medical Center, and Cornell Medical School. She worked for 7 years under sex therapist Helen Singer Kaplan, who you may have heard of as well, but really 2 years were under her and 5 years were under other therapists. Finally, in 1965, after 9 years of living in the United States, Dr. Ruth became a naturalized U.S. citizen. And in 1961, she married for the third time, and she regained her German citizenship in 2007 through a German citizenship project. This is another initiative that was set up because these people were heinously and unlawfully taken from everything they had known and displaced. This was a pathway to get your German citizenship back while not losing your citizenship in your home country or your now home country. At that point, she became a dual citizen of the United States and of Germany. I should say this now, Dr. Ruth spoke English, German, Hebrew, and French. That said, let's go on into part 3. Part 3, a spectacular career. After earning her doctorate degree, Dr. Ruth worked for a short time at Planned Parenthood in Harlem. It was there where she actually trained women to teach sex education. She also did postdoctoral research at New York's Presbyterian Hospital. And at this point, I really just want to list off some of the universities where she worked as an adjunct professor. Her career just takes off from here. To name a few, she worked at Columbia University, Yale University, Princeton University, New York University, Cornell Medical Center, and West Point, and that's not all of them. During this time, she also treated sex therapy patients in a private practice that she had in Manhattan. But what I really want to get into is her media career, because this is how I learned about Dr. Ruth in the 90s. But little did I know at that time that is not where she started, as we've already talked about. But her media career actually started with a radio show in 1980 when she was 52 years old. Her radio show was called Sexually Speaking on WYNY-FM. It was a format where people would call in and ask questions and she would answer those questions. Dr. Ruth would give it to you straight, but she was also like a calming presence. She was funny. She just had like a natural charisma. And I'm saying this from watching her on her TV show in the 90s, but we'll get to that. After 1 year of her radio show, so we're in 1981, y'all, she was getting 250,000 listeners every week, despite the network not doing any kind of advertisement or promotion for her show. So her show was spreading by word of mouth. 2 years later, in 1983, her show was the top rated show in the country's largest radio market. And I just want to say, this was a time where people didn't talk about that on TV. Even if we jump forward, I'm going to get into it later, but there were shows that shocked people in the 90s, and this was in 1980, and now we're in 1983. In 1984, she got syndication. This is where your show is sold and it can be played on numerous radio stations. She's still doing her show, yet is being broadcast to 93 markets. This meant her radio show was nationwide, so this would have increased her income, her presence, but most of all, everybody started to know Dr. Ruth. This was a big jump because this got her the national recognition that she needed, which led to her television show on Lifetime TV network. It was called Good Sex with Dr. Ruth Westheimer, and that was the first name. It did change names later. And it came on late, y'all. It came on at 10 p.m. on weeknights. So to put this in perspective, I grew up in the 90s, and in the 90s even, there was a time where your TV went off. Yes, I said your TV went off. You would get the color screen with the but they would put it on. So this was pretty late. It was popular. It took off. And she would end each show by reminding her audience to have good sex. The show was so popular that the next year, her show was extended to a full hour and they changed the name to the Dr. Ruth Show. At one point during the show, 3,000 people would try to call through every time the show aired. And it was getting 450,000 viewers a night. These are big numbers for 1985. To explain how big these numbers are, Lifetime was a big thing in the 80s and the 90s too. Some people still watch Lifetime, I don't, but especially in the 90s, it was a big thing. Dr. Ruth's show had more viewers than any other show, any other thing playing on Lifetime. If you think that's impressive, her number rose to 2 million homes a week. We didn't have YouTube, we didn't have Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, none of that. So these were huge numbers. During this time, she also appeared as an actress, guest spots, and she would sing too. She did this movie with Sigourney Weaver playing a wealthy philanthropist. In 1985, they actually released a board game. It was called Dr. Ruth's Game of Good Sex. The person who put the game out, they had to compare it to the game Trivial Pursuit because the orders overshadowed anything that their company had put out in their, at that time, 100-year history. Jumping forward to 1986, she got the same game, but a computer game. These are the computers it played on, y'all. The Commodore 64, MS-DOS, and Apple II. And computers were not widely spread at that time. To push us on through the 80s, Dr. Ruth returned to the Lifetime Network in 1988. She also appeared on the TV Guide cover that same year. Her new show was now called the all-new Dr. Ruth Show. In 1989, she actually got 2 teen advice shows, and it was a similar format. It was a call-in show, and it was called You Are on the Air with Dr. Ruth. From the time she got on TV and her TV show blew up until close to her death, Dr. Ruth would appear on TV shows. So in the 80s, you would see her on Johnny Carson and David Letterman. She also did the Arsenio Hall show, which was a huge show during that time. She was on Live with Regis and Kathy. That was before Kathy Lee left. And she even had a TV commercial for mouthwash. But let's go to part 4, the 1990s. The 90s kicked off with Dr. Ruth's House, which was an ABC sitcom. It was always meant to be a limited run. But more amazingly, Dr. Ruth had a talk show that was in Hebrew. It was an Israeli show. It translated to kind of a program. And it was very similar to her show in the United States. She did have a co-host for that show. But this stuff is groundbreaking, guys. In 1994, she got a new computer game on the CD-ROM adaptation of Dr. Ruth's Encyclopedia of Sex. It was released for Windows and a Philips CDI. Some of y'all like, what? In 1995, she hosted a series of Playboy instructional videos, and they were called Making Love. It was during this time that Dr. Ruth talked more about connecting religion to the things she taught. And I think it was because, and this part is my opinion, because religion is so often used to scandalize these types of teachings. I'm going to read a couple of quotes. And she said, the great Rabbi Simeon ben Halafta called the penis the great peacemaker of the home. She also referred to the book of Ruth, encouraging single women to initiate intercourse as long as it was leading to marriage. She also cited the Talmudic mandate that an unemployed man must make love to his wife every day. She would connect different religions to de-scandalize, is that a word? To make this not a taboo subject. The end of the 90s brought more TV appearances for Dr. Ruth outside of her own shows. She was a guest on the soap opera One Life to Live. She even appeared in Quantum Leap. She even did the Howard Stern Show. She did Late Night with Conan O'Brien and The Daily Show. There was an old show called Celebrity Deathmatch. I used to love this show, but she was even portrayed in Celebrity Deathmatch. The significance of this, Dr. Ruth had such a long life. You recognize some of those shows' names, like The Daily Show is still on air. Conan O'Brien is still around. She also had commercials for Herbal Essence. She did a Pepsi commercial, and she did a commercial for the Honda Prelude. Let's go to part 5, more amazing accolades. Even though Dr. Ruth was born in 1928, she did not pass away until last year, 2024. So her life was long and it was impactful. So in the 2000s, she did even more commercials, and she did a PBS children's show. It was all about helping anxious children overcome their fear of long words so that they could read and they could spell. Remember that her background was rooted in early childhood education, and that would have been important to her as a girl who was was denied a formal education. She made over 10 appearances on Hollywood Squares, the game show, that's right. Vanity Fair named her one of 12 women who changed the way we looked at sex. From 2010 to 2024, she appeared on Rachel Ray, The Today Show. In 2019, she published her 45th book. On her 91st birthday, she went on the Ellen DeGeneres Show. Dr. Ruth also appeared during this time on Late Night with Seth Meyers, The View, Stray Hands, Sarah and Kiki, and she had over 100,000 followers on Twitter. I want to read a quote about the Holocaust that she made in 2021. We must keep saying to the young people, think of these words, never again, never again. All of this must never happen again. Another little known fact about Dr. Ruth is that she was an accomplished ethnographer. This is someone who studies people and culture through observation. She was also a board member on the Museum of Jewish History in Lower Manhattan in New York. Dr. Ruth's name was added to the Bronx Walk of Fame, which I didn't even know was a thing. She got the Motion Picture Theaters Bookers Association Star of Tomorrow Award. She got the Magnus Hirschfeld Medal. She got medals, awards. Her papers were put into the Library of Congress in 2022. This woman was so accomplished, but I want to go back and talk a little more about her beliefs and her personal life. So we talked about how she was married 3 times. She ended up marrying Manfred Westheimer, who they called Fred. He was a Holocaust survivor as well. Dr. Ruth said that her 3rd marriage was a real marriage. They were married for 36 years until his death. In addition to her daughter from her 2nd marriage, she also had a son with Mr. Westheimer. Her daughter, Dr. Miriam Westheimer, is an educator and an author and the chief program officer of Hippie International. Hippie is in a lot of places in the United States. They focus on early childhood material so that you could get books and things at home, things to support your child's early learning before they start school. Her son, Joel Westheimer, is a professor at the University of Ottawa. Jokingly so, she said that she was shocked that she had 2 children because she was only 4'7". She couldn't believe that anything could grow inside of her. She was so short. Some things have changed. In December 2014, Dr. Ruth was a guest at a wedding in the Bronx, and the groom, Rabbi Benjamin Goldschmitz, was the grandson of a woman who helped her escape Nazi Germany. Isn't that crazy? In 2023, Governor Kathy Hochul of New York appointed Dr. Ruth as loneliness ambassador because Dr. Ruth had concerns about the loneliness of people, and I dare say she was right. Dr. Ruth lived life out loud. That's the best way I can describe it. She revolutionized the talk about sex education. She really changed views for a lot of people. She answered questions on her TV show. It was shocking at that time. You know, I remember being pretty young and I would watch her show. Parents didn't pay attention to you like that in the 90s. They just didn't, you know, even good parents, they didn't. But I would watch her show and she would talk about a range of sexual issues. She talked about impotence. She talked about orgasms. She talked about fantasies. She was of the belief that, hey, it was okay if you want to fantasize that a whole football team is in the room with you. This is something she said before. Then that is okay. And she also thought that if you were in a marriage, it was okay to explore. You didn't have to live by these strict rules that people had imposed views, especially for women. She just did not subscribe to those things. She covered self-pleasure. She covered positions, so many things. She just believed that if there were 2 consenting adults, what you did in the privacy of your home, or as she said, or on your kitchen floor, was your business. She did speak out against some things. She spoke out against any kind of intercourse under pressure. She was not for that at all, as she shouldn't be. She was against the use of drugs. Drugs alter your mental state. She spoke out against people who harm children and people who harm other people to gain pleasure. In addition to this, Dr. Ruth was an educator. Never forget it. She educated so many people on STDs. People who wouldn't have known any better if she hadn't been the person out there speaking freely about it. And she was all about contraception. She was pro-choice. She was more for relationships and not so much for one-night stands. And she was in favor of research for AIDS. Again, Dr. Ruth gave serious advice. She changed lives. She was candid. I mean, she was straight to the point, and she was funny. And her tag phrase for so long was "get some." That leads me into the last section, my final thoughts. I remember watching Dr. Ruth on TV late at night. I'm pretty sure my parents did not know that's what I was watching, but I do remember her being very charismatic, very educational, and definitely making me laugh a lot. Being shocked at some of the questions people asked because of the times, but also learning a lot. Under Dr. Ruth, I did. And I remember thinking that what this lady is doing, even at that age, I knew this was something special. This was something different. This was something transformative. That's the word I would use. But now to come back all of these years later and read about Dr. Ruth, her life is such a shocker to me. A lot of people would have quit. They would have gave up, but she kept going. The names of the people she studied over snatched me because these are people who were top of the field in their fields. And to think, what do you do when you train under these types of people with these kinds of renown, where Dr. Ruth forged her own path? It was almost like she came out of nowhere, but she came from a strong background, from a strong people, and she revolutionized the world. She got this talk show, and from there she just ran. Do you understand the things she talked about just weren't publicly talked about, especially on radio and TV? I think it was another case where you have this group of people, they're so used to doing things a certain way, but there's definitely a curiosity and, dare I say, a majority of people who really want to learn but are afraid to speak out. And here comes somebody like Dr. Ruth, who really talked about these serious topics, but she didn't just talk about them clinically all the time. She talked about them in real ways. She talked about self-pleasure. She talked about impotence, things that people were ashamed of. She took the stigma out of it. And to know she never lost her roots, she went back and used her misfortunes, hardships that were forced on her as a child. She came back and she grew up and she used those to get scholarships, to immigrate, to live in different countries, to become the best person she could be. But that wasn't enough. She did something that helped. I don't know how many people Dr. Ruth helped. It has to be a big number, because you help somebody by teaching them a better way, and then they teach somebody else. To know that she was a sniper or trained to be a sniper, this woman has so many moving parts to her, and that's what people are. You know, one of the best quotes comes from Shrek to me. He said, "I'm like an onion. You have to peel back the layer," and certainly she was layered. Ultimately, my opinion of Dr. Ruth is that she was inspiring. This is not my first time reading about her. Dr. Ruth tells a story of overcoming trauma, overcoming things that are not within your control, but finding your way and your voice and doing something. It could be small or big, and it can still make a huge impact. And Dr. Ruth made a huge impact. On another note, you never know what people have been through, come through, seen, or done. Dr. Ruth used her experiences to reach out to humanity, and she did it in a different way, in a big way. I even think about shows like the Golden Girls in the 90s. They were making people gasp in shock. A lot of that stuff aged great. I still watch this show, but Dr. Ruth kind of paved the way for shows like that to even exist. Dr. Ruth died in her 3-bedroom apartment in Manhattan, a little bit cluttered, you know, but she says she never wanted to move because she was living near her 2 synagogues where she practiced her faith. And I just think that speaks even more about who she was. I hope that you learned something new. I hope that Dr. Ruth inspired you. Tell me in the comments, do you remember Dr. Ruth? Did you ever listen to her radio show or talk show? I haven't looked it up, y'all, but I'm pretty sure somebody's probably put clips of her on YouTube. But ultimately, I hope that you are inspired by some part of her story or gain hope if you're feeling hopeless, because if Dr. Ruth could do what she did, then there is hope that you can overcome and do so many things. And until next time, keep learning, be happy, and always have a blessed day. Bye bye.